What's going on, everybody? And welcome back to another week here on Gunz Butta with your favorite cousin, Kinda G. Y'all, it is officially the Gunz Butta 1 year anniversary.
I never knew there was a love like this before.
You know how excited I am to actually be able to say that? But y'all, we had a time this year up here on this podcast. I was just sitting up here doing a little recap of all the episodes I dropped this year. And I'm like, wow. First of all, the year just flew by. And secondly, I really did it. I created a true crime podcast and I talked about all of the cases that I wanted to talk about this year. So, with that being said, this episode is just going to be a nice little bonus for y'all, just a little bonus episode. And it's just going to be kind of like a quick recap of my top 3 to 4 favorite episodes from the year. And as we progress throughout the years, cousins, I do want this to be more listener or audience focused, where y'all tell me what your favorite episodes are. And then I'll spice it up and give y'all a little Gunz Butta countdown of the top 10 favorite episodes from the year. But y'all, I'm not even gonna lie to you. We started from the bottom. I was just sitting up here trying to replay my first episode and I was cringing at how bad the audio was, how bad my storytelling was. And surprisingly enough, my first episode got me the most listens. Hey, we had to start somewhere, right? But if y'all been down with me since that very first episode, thank you. The editing definitely got better. The storytelling definitely improved, got more visual, got more detailed. But along with all of our accomplishments and milestones that we hit this year, comes mistakes and learning opportunities. I mean, just off the top of my head, if y'all remember the episode The Hot Girl, the case about 27-year-old Tamara Green. I know y'all remember that one. It was the one about the huge conspiracy theory surrounding the mayor of Detroit killing this exotic dancer, or having her killed rather. But y'all, the case took place in 2003, and for some reason I kept saying 2023. I said whatever, they knew what I meant. But I will say one of the most helpful and encouraging pieces of advice that I received throughout the year was to just keep going and stay consistent, keep pushing out episodes, and that's exactly what I did. And although some weeks and some days I'll be sitting up here for hours like, am I even gonna drop? Like, what am I doing? Am I gonna release an episode this week? Should I do the research? But despite all of that, I actually really did enjoy finding all of these cases to tell y'all about every week. And I learned so much about the law and how messed up the justice system is. And I also learned the do's and don'ts of committing a crime. Just in case. But cousins, I'm not going to keep y'all waiting any longer. In honor of this being the new year and the 1 year anniversary of the podcast, y'all can go ahead and grab yourself a glass of champagne, some popcorn, and let's dive into this very brief bonus episode of my top 3 cases from 2024.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
Alright, y'all, to kick off the countdown is number 3, episode 18, Young and Dumb. And if y'all remember this episode, it involves 3 dumb teenagers, Ronald Bell, his girlfriend Crystal Maestas, and her best friend Renee Lynx. So the 3 of them beat, then kidnap, then brutally torture and kill 31-year-old Cordell Richards. So Crystal was only 16 years old at the time. And I want to say she had moved out of her parents' house because she didn't want to follow the rules or something like that. So her 17-year-old boyfriend, Ron, he wants to jump to her rescue. So he finds Cordell's ad in the newspaper asking for a roommate. So yes, he's 31 and she's only 16, but I'm sure she told him some sob story and he agreed to let her move in. Now, I'm sure in this agreement, Cordell's like, okay, yeah, she's 16, but you still gonna pay your half of the rent, right? But she didn't have a job to pay the rent. So Ron's like, don't worry, baby girl, I got you. So Ron goes out and he gets himself a little job and he's gonna help Crystal pay the rent. So after not being roommates for long at all, Crystal goes to Ron and tells him that Cordell has been coming on to her, making passes at her, and just making her really uncomfortable in this living situation. So at first, Ron goes out and he buys her a deadbolt for her room door, and he gets her a bat to keep in her room. For safety purposes, just in case Cordell gets out of hand. But that didn't seem to keep Cordell out, supposedly. So the story is, Cordell busts in Crystal's room while she's hanging out with her homegirl Renee. And he's just making the both of them really uncomfortable. On top of that, he had supposedly already assaulted her, pushing her up against the wall, and he was always walking around in his whitey tighties. So she runs and tells Ron this, and on February 2nd, 1999, Ron, Crystal, and Renee are hanging out in Cordell's apartment when they essentially ambush him. They beat him with a baseball bat, they tie him up, and then they drive him out to the woods of Fort Walton Beach, Florida. When they get him out to the woods, they tie him up to a tree and beat him for hours. And if I'm remembering correctly, this went on for 2 days, because after beating him mercilessly, then leaving him to die chained to a tree, they didn't feel like that was enough, because after beating him with this bat, they decided to set him on fire. So like all good criminals, the three of them decided to return to the scene of the crime the next day, just to make sure that they had finished the job and all. But when they came back the next day, to their surprise, Cordell was still alive and begging for his life. So they end up leaving again to go to the store. At the store, they purchase a meat cleaver and duct tape. Then they return back to Cordell's body. And shockingly, Cordell is still alive. So with this big-ass meat cleaver, Ron walks up to Cordell's chained, beaten, and burned body and slices his throat. As they're walking back to the car, Ron's like, I don't think I cut his throat deep enough. He then goes back to Cordell's body and slices his throat again. But this time, he makes sure it went clean to the bone. After killing Cordell, they disposed of all the evidence, they returned the meat cleaver back to the store, and then moved into his apartment. So when it was all said and done, Renee ended up coming forward with information about Cordell's murder, and she was only given a 15-year sentence. Meanwhile, Ron and Crystal were given mandatory life without the possibility of parole sentences. Now, in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that minors cannot be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. So they would be given the opportunity to have their cases retried. So in 2018, Ron was given a resentencing hearing, but the judge gave him the same sentence, life. And I believe Crystal had a resentencing hearing as well, and the judge gave her the same thing, life. Again. All right, y'all. Number 2 on the countdown are episodes 34 and 35. The Grim Sleeper. Now, over the summer, I dropped season 2, and that's when I started to introduce serial killers. Samuel Little, Alton Coleman, and Deborah Brown, and just recently, Jason Scott. But the Grim Sleeper was definitely one of my favorites, because Lonnie Franklin, aka the Grim Sleeper, aka the 25 caliber killer, was driving around South Central LA picking up young, vulnerable women and shooting them at point blank in his little orange Pinto. He would offer them drinks or drugs or maybe just a ride somewhere, and once they got in, he would drive them around, and after not long at all, he would pull out his 25 caliber gun and shoot them point blank in the head. He would then dump their bodies in alleys or in dumpsters or even in a rough part of town. He really didn't care. And then just carry on with his normal life. Because in his day-to-day, he was a family man, he was a father, he was a neighborhood guy, a talker, a people person. And nobody ever suspected that he was out here killing all these women. So he went on a 3-year killing spree from 1985 to 1988. Then he took a 14-year hiatus, hence how he got the name Sleeper. Then he returned to the streets in 2002. Now, during the time he was committing all of his crimes, there was also a plethora of other serial killers also in LA during this time period. So it was really hard for detectives to distinguish which killing was being done by which serial killer, or if it was just its own isolated homicide. On top of that, they were in the middle of the crack epidemic, gang violence, NWA. There was just a lot going on in LA during this time period. So originally they were calling these the 25 caliber killings. And for years, Detectives could not figure out who had been dumping these women's bodies. And it wasn't until 2010 when Lonnie's son Christopher got arrested. And during his arrest, he had to give a DNA sample. And when he gave his DNA sample, it brought a familial DNA match to Lonnie Franklin. So finally, after being arrested, Lonnie was sentenced to death. But only 4 years into his sentence, on March 28th, 2020, his ass died. And finally, number 3, episode number 14, the Fragrant Odor. Y'all, I don't know why, but this was my favorite episode from 2024. Because this woman Latrice did what every woman dreams about doing when they find out their husband is cheating on them. I had such a good time recording this episode, and I felt like the visuals I was giving y'all was everything. So Latrice finds out that her husband, Walter Dancy, the ladies' man, has been sleeping around, sucking and fucking on everybody in town and just playing in her face. So she takes a shotgun and shoots him point blank in the chest. She then hides his body in the closet until she figures out what to do next. Because at this point, she was already in way too deep. So she runs on down to the hardware store and buys 2 gallons of hydrochloric acid. She comes back home, she puts Walter in the bathtub, and she starts dumping this acid all over his body. And in her mind, she's thinking he's gonna start melting and shriveling up, and she's gonna be able to just rinse him down the drain. But his skin just starts bubbling and fizzing, but nothing. He was still there. So her next plan to get rid of his body was to set him on fire in the house. So she starts the fire, and she has to open the bathroom window because there's nowhere else for the smoke to go. But of course, everybody's looking at her house because they're like, where's all of this smoke coming from? So to be more inconspicuous, she gets her barbecue grill and pulls it up to the bathroom window and just starts barbecuing pounds and pounds of meat. But this little bathroom fire she started still wasn't enough to get rid of Walter's body. So after the acid and burning Walter didn't work, Latrice still needed to cover up this fragrant odor of death that was coming from Walter's corpse. So she decided she was just going to spray the house with Febreze and a whole bunch of incense and stuff to make the house smell good. But still, that wasn't working. So her last resort was to drive his body to the Everglades. But she ends up locking herself out of the house. But by this time, her neighbors were already onto her. So while she's panicking, trying to figure out what to do next, she just breaks down. Like, by this time, she's over it. She's done running and hiding and trying to cover up Walter's dead body. So she breaks down and she calls her dad. When her dad gets there, he convinces her to turn herself in, and that's what she did. So when it was all said and done, she confessed to everything. I mean, there really wasn't anything that she could lie about at this point, but she was sentenced to 45 years. I'm sure Latrice be sitting in her cell thinking about all the things she could have done differently in that situation. And I know she be thinking, damn, I took it a little too far, didn't I? All right now, cousins, those were my top 3 episodes from this year. I told y'all I wasn't going to be keeping y'all here very long. It was just going to be a little short, sweet bonus episode in honor of the 1-year anniversary. Wait. Before I close this out, I want to tell y'all about one more case. I call this one my most underrated case because I just knew with this one, I was finna blow up. I was finna go straight to the top of the podcast world, and I was just gonna be all over the media. Like, I was just gonna be her. But of course that didn't happen. And like I said, this was my most underrated episode to me. This was episode 16, One Last Call. This case took place in South Dallas, and it was the murder of 32-year-old Deanna Cook. She was drowned in her own bathtub by her crazy-ass ex-husband after beating her on multiple other occasions, stalking her. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, then nobody could. And believe it or not, her entire drowning was recorded on a 911 call. But surprisingly enough, it wasn't the 911 call that saved her life. Her body was discovered a couple of days later by her mom, her sister, and her 2 young daughters. This one really broke my heart, for real. But yeah, y'all, those are my top cases from 2024. But really and truly, all my episodes were a hit. I'm just gonna hype myself up and say it. But for real, cousins, 2025, Guns and Butter, we going up. And with that, y'all already know I'm gonna be bringing y'all so many more juicy cases. And don't forget, we're getting the YouTube channel up and popping, so I will be dropping videos to go with the audio, so stay tuned for that as well. But I'll see y'all back here at the dinner table on Friday for our regular scheduled episode. Hope y'all enjoyed this episode, and Happy New Year.
That's what it's all about.